Well, I want to thank everybody who found today's Scientia talk. We're usually in a different room, but today we're going back to our roots in the Kyle Morrow room. I can remember when I think I first started going to Scientia, and it was always held here back in the early 80s. So I'm Rick Wilson, the director of Scientia, and I'd like to thank you for attending today's lecture. This year's series is on the topic of facts. And so far, we've covered all kinds of facts in these talks, ranging from true facts to false facts to alternative facts. And so today, we're going to conclude our lecture series with Johanna Dunaway speaking to us on the topic of the questionable relevance of facts, information, beliefs, and identity. Well, when we were thinking of someone to speak on the topic of facts in the media, which is what Johanna's specialty is, I immediately thought of her. She's written extensively on the structural causes of bias in the media and the role of polarization. Professor Dunaway earned her BA from the University of North Texas and her PhD from Rice University in 2006 in my very own Department of Political Science. Professor Dunaway is currently an Associate Professor of Communication at Texas A&M University. Before joining the faculty at A&M, she was at Louisiana State University in the Department of Political Science in the Manship School of Mass Communication. Well, her current research examines the impact of changing contemporary media environment across individuals, groups, and local communities. Her work examines local news, coverage of political campaigns, immigration, and events, including the 2010 oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. She publishes in numerous areas, including public opinion, political behavior, and political advertising. Her work has appeared in many different journals, including the Journal of Politics, Public Opinion Quarterly, Journal of Communication, Political Communication, Political Research Quarterly, a whole array of journals. She's also the co-author of the 9th edition of Mass Media and American Politics. Excuse me. In 2016, she was the Joan Shorenstein Fellow at the Shorenstein Center for People in the Press at Harvard University. Well, it's my great pleasure to welcome Johanna back to Rice and have her wrap up this year's Scientia lecture on facts. So please join me in welcoming her. Thank you, Johanna.
So thank you so much for being here today. It's a real pleasure to be invited back to campus. And so obviously this topic is of interest to a lot of people and for reasons we can understand, right? So in the campaign environment, the presidential campaign environment, we saw lots of allegations of misinformation, strategic misinformation. And so today, the interest in part makes this topic a little bit overwhelming because it seems like almost every day we're learning about a new situation in which misinformation has been shared or used for some strategic gain. And so people are really, really interested in this. And I knew that I wanted to talk about the media, but I also felt compelled to narrow the focus of the topic a little bit to focus on a particular kind of misinformation. So one reason for that is that I think some of the urgency people are feeling and the interest they're feeling in the topic is with regard to the specific use of misinformation in the electoral context, or at least the political context. So I want to focus there. And the other thing I want to talk about today is the role that the media plays in facilitating some of the misinformation. And specifically, I want to focus on what some of the changing aspects of the communication environment mean for the creation and sharing and dissemination of misinformation, as well as what the features of those different kinds of platforms and channel offerings mean for how we process that information. And then I want to talk about one more really important thing, and this is something that I think is becoming really salient in the research, but that is probably underappreciated in some of the conversations that are happening about misinformation. And this is the role that our political identities and our political predispositions play in how we process information and how we seek out information in the first place. Okay, so as I mentioned, I want to focus on a specific kind of misinformation. We can imagine a lot of different types of misinformation, some of which have been around for a long time, right? So I just threw up a couple of really basic examples here. You might think of slanted news as a form of misinformation. You might think of misleading ads, but those are things that have been around for a long time, right? These are things that we're very familiar with historically. Candidate statements that focus or that might be slightly misrepresentative to very misrepresentative. But I think what is a newer situation that we are dealing with is probably this likelihood we have of encountering completely false accounts or completely false news that looks like news of some form that should be coming from an ostensibly credible source. So I think that I'm going to kind of ask you to keep that kind of misinformation in mind as one of the key types that we're thinking about today. I do want to acknowledge, though, that it's important to keep in mind that there are subtle forms of misinformation that we're all aware of, but that aren't really quite the star of the show when we're in our kind of current conversations about misinformation. And those are the subtler forms that we encounter that we still see a lot of, where people kind of mention a half-truth, or they mention a piece of information that suggests one fact to be true, but when in fact, if it was discussed in the full context of that event or issue, it would actually be clear that what they were emphasizing was relatively misleading in terms of the determination we would make. An example would be to talk about rising sea levels one year without considering what climate change looks like in terms of an overall pattern, right? Leaving out the relevant context. Those are hard to detect, or harder to detect for information consumers, and would be harder to detect for any kind of technological tools we might develop with the effort of identifying and purging social media, for example, of misinformation. But we also need to think about, in addition to kind of isolating the examples we're thinking about to these kind of fake news type examples, we want to think, I think, carefully about the source of where this information comes from. So when we think about strategic political misinformation, maybe disguised as news, or appearing when a lot of strategic political information or misinformation appears in a news story and it's heavily emphasized. If we think about those kinds of communications, we know that they tend to originate with political actors or institutions with some kind of political agenda, right? Again, that's something that's not new. This can be parties, candidates, interest groups, domestic or foreign governments, and media actors can be another source on their own. They can have economic incentives, or they can have their own political incentives, and they're really more interested in using their media platform to make arguments about politics or ideology instead of actually producing journalism. And then we have these kind of rogue actors out in the communication environment that are creating fake news sites or fake information sites just for the purpose of stirring up conflict or entering the political debate, tipping the scales, or even simply to produce outrageous content that generates a lot of clicks and eyeball attention that can earn ad revenue. We see all of these examples. And these are all probably important examples to consider, but probably can't fit within the context of one talk. I was trying to think about how we can arrange these along some ways of organizing the different examples. And I've kind of plotted different examples along this degree of falseness, like I did in the previous slide. And then I added what might not be the perfect way of thinking about it, but a layer that helps us think about source credibility. And so I think where we might be most concerned with misinformation is when it appears in kind of this upper right quadrant, right, where we think false information is coming from something that could be judged as a highly credible source, but that is clearly spreading false information. And it is true that in the current media setting, we know that one person's highly credible source is not necessarily another's. And this kind of leads us to sort of think about the various problems, some of the problems with the new media environment, which is that the increasingly fragmented environment adds some complexity to our ability to figure out a shared understanding of what sources should be deemed as credible and what sources should not. And that's partly because a lot of these new platforms, as you all know, allow for content sharing that occurs through social networks. It doesn't just come directly from a media outlet or from us seeking out a media outlet. It can be shared through close acquaintances, family members, or people that we admire and trust in terms of their political opinions. So it really muddies the water in terms of how people can identify which media sources should be credible. And it's hard for us to think about what media sources or sources of information might be viewed as credible by others. I think so it might be fair to say that we can agree to be concerned about misleading information when it is clearly coming from, when it is clearly created with the aim of a strategic goal, a political one, but it appears to be coming, and it's false, misinformation, but it appears to be coming from something that appears to be credible on its surface, okay? I think we're less concerned, in other words, with communication that's clearly coming from a candidate or a party or a campaign, because when most people see that kind of information, they know that there is a set of strategic considerations that person has in mind when crafting their message, right? So these are the kinds of things that we're less worried about. It's when we don't quite understand the motive, because the source credibility is either kind of seems neutral or is unclear, that we might be most trusting of that kind of information. And that's why I think this type right here is particularly important to address. And as you've learned through other lectures in this series, if you were able to attend any of them, there are lots of other important kinds of misinformation. So we're seeing misinformation about vaccines and their effectiveness, for example, or how to prevent the spread of Zika. And we know that factual corrections, for example, aren't really always effective in correcting misinformation in those areas. Those are very important aspects of misinformation. But this is a sort of a different kind, right? And we also know that scientific facts are often discussed in a misleading way, and some of those conversations are, at least true and false information is sometimes treated as equivalent, and there are a lot of mixed signals there. But I think this kind in particular with the electoral setting is important given the salience of the concerns we've had in this area. Okay, so the other thing we want to think about is how the information is disseminated. And this is something else that is a newer set of concerns. Not brand new, but I think in light of recent events, we are probably particularly concerned about social media. Partly because of the way we share information, as I mentioned a moment ago, and because online content is able to be disseminated in such a rapid, at such a rapid pace, and then the initial sharing of information can be repeated and repeated and repeated, so that thousands and then millions can instantly see information very quickly. So people are particularly, when I say people, I mean researchers, public commentators, and the public are especially interested in, I think, these kind of latest three categories of change to the media environment and what they mean for misinformation and its potential to have an effect. So cable news is one, the arrival of cable news. Even though that's been around for a while, we as researchers are still grappling with what the arrival of cable has meant for the kind of media and information we're exposed to and the different kinds of opinions and facts we're exposed to. Also websites, just basic online news or political sites. How likely is it that we get misinformation there? More importantly, how many people see that information? And then in social media as well, partly, as I said, from these recent salient examples. And the platform, as I'll talk about in a minute, has particular characteristics that are, I think, especially vulnerable to being used for strategic gain in this way, right? Social media platforms have a sharing structure and a social nature that make us share information in ways that aren't possible, or allow us to share information in ways that aren't possible with other forms of media. And we're also exposed to information we might not otherwise be exposed to on social media platforms. Okay, and then why do we care about this information? Just this kind of misinformation. Just very basically, I think if we think about this kind of political information, strategically developed, kind of shared in a sneaky way by ostensibly credible sources and through these different forms of communication, these newer platforms in particular, why do we care? I think it's probably fair to say, just in a very basic way, it's because democracy, the ideal version anyway, hopes that people have at least a basic level of facts on which they can make their political decisions. And we don't want people making their minds up or changing their minds about politics on the basis of false information. Pretty obvious, right? And these kind of two considerations are described in almost every article that's being written right now, scholarly article, on why they're investigating fake news or the spread of misinformation. And we talk about these reasons. But there's something that's important to point out, is that this concern is based on the assumption that exposure to this kind of information has the potential to really shape or change political attitudes, public opinion, partisan identities, or voting outcomes. And this is something that I'm going to challenge a little bit in a minute. So when we think about the changing information environment, it's not new that people have concerns. Some of the changes we're experiencing now are happening simultaneously almost, and they keep changing, and they're happening in a pretty rapid succession. So even though we've kind of been through this before in terms of, we were nervous when the arrival of television showed up and gave us audiovisual forms of news because we were worried that it would become superficial, entertainment-oriented, and less informative. Some of that turned out to be true, but the effects weren't as drastic as once feared, right? But with these kind of unfolding trends, the arrival of the internet kind of exacerbated some trends that we were already seeing in place from the arrival of cable. Social media, social networking sites kind of added yet another layer of disruption. And even the shift to mobile communication is changing a lot about the kinds of information we're exposed to. So I think people are thinking about these questions. What do these different changes mean for our likelihood of encountering misinformation? And what is the relationship of those changes to our willingness to accept or process or pay attention to misinformation? Researchers are still debating the changes that have resulted just from the arrival of cable. And one reason for that is just the significant expansion of choice that cable brought to media consumers has allowed for the structure of the vast choice has allowed for a different pattern of information seeking and information choice, audience selection, that has resulted in different patterns of the dissemination of information and the choices we make, and therefore the kinds of information we're exposed to. So people are asking questions about and highly interested in questions about what these effects mean. But what have we actually learned from some of the scholarly evidence on this? We can start by thinking about, one thing that I think some of this work makes apparent is that we should probably be thinking about 2 stages of a process, because we know that these changes are having effects on both the kind of pre-exposure process, or the process of selecting media or seeking out media in the first place, and then they also have implications for how we process the information once we are exposed to it, okay? So all the changes that have been brought about through media choice have an effect, for example, on this pre-exposure process. And then we're learning a lot about how different cognitive biases and psychological tendencies also interact with these newer platforms and new or different kinds of content to shape how those messages are processed as well. So we see an effect of these changing communication technologies sort of at both stages. Okay, so let's first talk about the expansion of media choice, why it matters. A lot of you probably know at least some of this story. So as you know from your own experience, and as is often discussed, the arrival of cable, all the different content selections, also called media fragmentation, has a big impact because it allows more specialized program choices, right? So people of various interests can choose different kinds of information. The immediate concern, on the one hand, there was a lot of optimism with more media choice, because people initially thought, oh, this means everyone can learn a lot more about news and politics all the time. They can become more democratically engaged, participate more. And that was kind of the optimistic take. There was some other pessimistic takes that we don't have to get into. And then there was another more pessimistic take that basically was widely articulated and advanced the argument that these more narrowly targeted program choices will create the demand for more specialized content. And in the realm of politics, it's going to lead to people making programming selections based on their political predispositions. And the problem with that, people argued, is that people will do this because of all sorts of psychological reasons. They prefer information they agree with. We'll talk about more of those in a minute. And they will just keep reselecting into that same like-minded information, and they will continue to avoid information they disagree with. And the new choices allow for that kind of audience selectivity, right? In the old days, most people were exposed to the same few media sources that were mainstream, and choice allows people to self-select into ideological silos, so to speak, or at least that was the concern. And so people have been thinking about whether this effect has actually panned out, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. The other kind of positive spin people advanced was that it would sort of, the arrival of all these different cable channels, for example, or even the arrival of the internet would mean the information environment would be a bit democratized, because it allows lower barriers of entry into the media environment, giving a voice to people and groups who otherwise wouldn't have a voice, right? Mainstream media dominated pretty much the communication stage for a long time, and we had this kind of top-down communication environment. But these new platforms give much more possibility of a public voice through websites and social media and so on. But the biggest concern was about the potential for these information echo chambers. And that's relevant for us in terms of misinformation, partly because people were concerned that that isolating behavior would lead to more partisan hostility, more partisan polarization, and no longer having a shared understanding of what the most important issues of the day were, or a shared set of concerns and things to debate democratically, okay? The idea is that the more we isolate into echo chambers where we only hear our side, the less we have that shared foundation for debate. Okay, so the big idea is just that these structural changes allow for different patterns of dissemination and exposure. And the concerns about selective exposure weren't unfounded in the sense that we do see some clustering. This is kind of old data, but the patterns kind of remain the same. You can see that more liberal people tend to choose more liberal outlets, and on the conservative side, you see the same patterns of behavior, but it's not completely isolated echo chambers, right? And so we do see that tendency. Scholarly work also kind of verifies the idea that people do selectively choose information when given a choice, for example, between two outlets, one on their side and the other on the opposing side, and maybe a neutral alternative in between. People tend to gravitate towards that information they agree with. It's much more comfortable for us psychologically to encounter information we agree with than it is information we don't agree with. So the argument is that those psychological needs will sort of push people to choose that information. And we do largely see those behaviors, but a lot of the ways that we were testing those behaviors involved only a few choices and didn't really simulate the high choice media environment. The concern about selective exposure, as I mentioned, was whether it fostered extreme differences in partisans across the partisan aisle and these echo chambers, and ultimately polarization among both elites and the mass public. In the world of misinformation, such as we're thinking about it right now, one thing people have worried about is whether the tendency to select into like-minded media, for example, means that we're more vulnerable to misinformation because we're more naturally inclined to, not have our defenses up when we're being selectively exposed to like-minded information. Okay, and we'll talk more about that in a moment too. But a lot of the initial concerns about information, echo chambers developing and the patterns of exposure we see actually didn't quite pan out, at least in terms of being as bad as once anticipated. But we've seen some other negative effects that have emerged. So one of the major consequences of media choice, I don't know how well you can see this graph, is that the effect of choice has another implication, and it's a pretty big one. And it's that there's a really large percentage of people, at least in the American public, who have a relative preference for entertainment over news. And some of the early ways of testing exposure didn't really account for this. But Marcus Pryor and others have argued that when we see choice, what we actually get, when we see choice expand, what we actually get is a growing gap between the people who are interested in political information and the people who are not. And the reason for that is that choice provides a lot more news programming and a lot more news options, but it also provides countless entertainment options. So now that we're in a world where the average household no longer has 10 channels, but has about 130, there's always something else on. And so people with entertainment preferences can always opt out of news. And so if we look at this from a big mass perspective, we can see that growing gap between people interested in politics and people who are not. The argument, as I think I mentioned before, is that incidental exposure to information, one reason the gap is growing is because that sort of smaller media market or that smaller array of media choices we used to have meant that most of us were kind of trapped as audiences for a certain part of the day, most days. And so even if we weren't paying attention or that interested in news, we were still being exposed to those network news programs. And so we were still learning. And the high choice environment typically just doesn't allow for that kind of at least repeated selective exposure. Okay, so when we turn to think about this in the context of misinformation, in some ways it can be thought of as positive news, although since I've spent a lot of my career trying to think about ways that people will be exposed to more and better news, it's sort of, it's makes me have mixed feelings, to say the least. We might, if there's a lot more information, misinformation being disseminated in a high choice media environment, we actually might be losing a lot of exposure because of so many people opting out of information sources that are likely to include public affairs information. We've seen this pattern happen. And this has been verified in other ways. Experimental studies that incorporate choice into their design, for example, also show that the effects of partisan news are minimized in that setting because so many people tune out or opt out of the political programming. And so with misinformation, it's not quite clear to us yet who's getting exposed and who isn't, and whether the patterns of information seeking for real information are going to be the ones that result in exposure to political misinformation as well. We might wonder though, okay, so sure, we might be losing the people who are not that interested. They might not be exposed to much misinformation just because they aren't on political sites or news sites, or they don't have a lot of politically engaged friends, or they aren't seeking out those sorts of websites. But when people who are motivated to seek out information are exposed to misinformation, there are other things to think about. And this is partly that they are more knowledgeable, more educated, and therefore more likely to have the kind of tools in their toolkit to fight the effects of misinformation, to counter-argue. Or they will completely disregard information altogether if it is prior or if it is counter to their existing beliefs. Because the more knowledgeable and more interested are also the more partisan, they tend to have stronger partisan identities and will be more likely to reject information, at least if it's coming from the other side. If they are more likely to kind of agree with misinformation because it's coming from their own side, that's fine. We can assume that there might be some sort of effect there, but the question is it actually persuasion if it's just going to increase their tendency to keep their same set of beliefs, right? In other words, the persuasion that might be happening from misinformation to these motivated information seekers is probably not going to result in attitude change or different political outcomes, at least in the short term. To be clear, it may have many other harmful effects, but whether we need to worry about short-term persuasion among either out-partisans or in-partisans is the question, right? And this is something we just don't know that much about yet. Okay, so the effects of, so that's, when we think about the high choice media environment, as Marcus Pryor and others kind of talked about it, and as it has been studied in more recent studies by Kevin Arsenault and Martin Johnson, for example, a lot of the focus has been on that initial arrival of cable and the internet. And so that's kind of one high choice media environment we can think about. But if we want to kind of separately consider social media as a special case or digital media, it's important to kind of think through the different effects that we've seen there. So for online news, one of the concerns, and for social media as well, has been the existence of filter bubbles. You guys have all heard this term. This is basically the term that we use to describe the filtering of content, algorithmic filtering of content that happens online and kind of dictates some of our selections, right? So when we search on Google and we get search returns that are ordered in a way that are somewhat dictated by our previous behaviors, or the way Facebook uses algorithms to determine what kind of messages and news stories and posts appear in our feed. So people were concerned about filter bubbles and created by these algorithms and whether there would be serious kind of selection biases based on those. And again, a lot of this work is focusing on the narrower problem of polarization and whether exposure to information just on one side was going to create real problems for our ability to have a healthy democratic information environment. And as it turns out, there's actually mixed evidence for ideological segregation or the echo chambers as they might exist online. And this comes from several sources. So lots of people have looked at this in lots of different ways. And just to keep it simple, we do see some segregating behaviors online, but some studies have found that it's actually probably less than people now experience in person. People end up, because of news aggregator sites and because of search behaviors and the way web traffic patterns are driven, people end up on a lot of the same pretty central, pretty mainstream news sites. When I say central mainstream news sites, I'm still including an outlet like Fox News, because even though it's right-leaning, it's still pretty mainstream and still covers a lot of the same topics, and isn't something that's way out on the fringe, like some other, I think, media properties that have emerged more recently. And we also see in the setting of Facebook, for example, even though people were also concerned that there were kind of echo chambers or a real degree of ideological segregation through social media networks, as it turns out, social media networks are actually heterogeneous. They're not super heterogeneous. They're typically populated by more group. There's a kind of majority-minority status in social media networks, but it's not the case that they are completely homogeneous in terms of ideology. Also, there is sharing of cross-ideology information on Facebook, and people are likely, not more likely than they are unlikely, but about, I think to the extent of like 20%, people will click on information, a link to a news story, even if it comes from an opposing news source, okay? And people share at similar rates. So even though most people are more inclined to share less information from the other side and less inclined to click on information from the other side, they still do it with some regularity. Also, when ideological segregation occurs online, it's more often dictated by people's choices than it is their filters, like through Facebook filters and other filtering processes. Some evidence there. One of the more one of the newer findings that I encountered that I think warrants a lot more investigation, but I think we should be concerned about, and we'll talk about more in a minute, is there is a real difference in the sharing and spread of information that can happen on social media platforms. For example, a recent study finds that rumors and lies tend to spread much faster than the truth, quite a bit faster, and that they are believed by about half the people that click on them, and they're shared at huge rates, okay? So that's really important in the sense that, if the exposure to misinformation is ramped up to a certain degree, then we're just bound to see some sort of effect. There are things about the platform that might minimize its impact in terms of how we process the content, but it's still disconcerting to learn about like a clear preference or attraction to misinformation. The evidence in that same study suggests that the reason negative information or false rumors were shared more often than truth is because of the novelty of the information and the emotional appeal of the information. Okay, so one thing that we need to also consider as we move forward, thinking about all this, is how the features of the content itself are going to interact with the advantages of these different platforms and also with our cognitive and political predispositions, and how all those things together will govern the effects. Another issue with social media information sharing that has implications for misinformation is the way we judge source credibility. So I think I mentioned a moment ago, these are social platforms, and so there's evidence out there that suggests that because of the social nature of the platforms, we tend to prioritize social cues over the traditional cues that might be associated with source credibility. So in the social media setting, we might even be more inclined to choose somebody because, Sarah sent that, or Sarah's the person who retweeted it, even though it might come from Fox and we might be liberal, or it might come from MSNBC and we might be conservative, we still might prioritize the social cue, which is that your friend in your network shared it. So there's some evidence that the kind of signals that we have about source credibility are mixed up with the social dimension on social media platforms, which also might mean more exposure to more kinds of misinformation than we would normally expect, or more kinds of information in general. A couple of notable things. One thing about news sites and the way people choose and seek information on news sites. One reason that I think exposure to misinformation and exposure to only like-minded information and things like that is more limited than people originally expected is just that there's a very low probability, well, there's a very low level of activity on the web that is actually dedicated to news and politics. We might be politically interested, and so we tend to exaggerate the proportion of the web that is dedicated to communicating about news and politics or even public affairs information. It's actually a startlingly low proportion of internet activity. Okay, and this is evidenced in web traffic and how much time people, not just how many people visit different websites about political information, but how long they stay. And these trends are even worse when we think about referrals from social media platforms. People might click on a link from social media and end up on a political site, but when they do, they bounce right off that site. So we might worry about information sharing, and we might worry about misinformation in particular on social media and people arriving to these false or fake news sites. But it's important to think about the behavior that happens once people get there, because it might be that exposure is actually quite fleeting and not really enough time is spent there for people to process the information. Okay, so then when we just think about this kind of pre-exposure side of the equation, exposure might be unlikely for many more people than we think to misinformation, simply because a lot of people aren't ever going to be on the kinds of sites or channels that will be sharing that kind of information. Motivated exposure can occur among the small group of the public that does care about these things and has sought out or entered the political information realm, if you want to think about it that way. Incidental exposure, as we've learned, is far less likely for those uninterested people on cable and online, but social media does allow for a lot more incidental exposure. Or at least it has the potential to, and there is evidence that we see higher rates of incidental exposure on social media. That's partly because we are trapped by the filtering of our social media platforms in many respects. And we're also trapped by the preferences and impulses of the people in our social media networks, right? We are a captive audience there. We have no choice in that environment, in other words. So what happens then when exposure occurs? I've already hinted at a lot of it. There's good news and bad news here, and frankly, there's also a lot here that we just don't know. We do know that exposure itself doesn't guarantee acceptance of the message or reception even, or attention. These are all required for persuasion. So just because people are encountering, even getting to the exposure stage and seeing misinformation, we don't know without further investigation, we don't know that misinformation is having any effect. We know we should observe probably really different effects for motivated exposure people versus those who end up there incidentally. And then we also know that the characteristic of the content itself and the platform on which it is delivered are all going to moderate the information processing. So there's a lot of points at which we might see drop-off in persuasive effects just because, especially when we think about online news, mobile formats for news, social media platforms, and how news consumption happens there, there's a lot of shortened attention spans, and there's a lot of impatience among users, unwillingness to wait for clicks and links and things to upload. And so the actual time we spend with that misleading content might be less than we might expect on those kinds of platforms. But the most important thing is that political identity is crucial to this part of the process. And this is the part that I mentioned earlier that I think is a little bit underappreciated in this conversation. We have growing evidence you guys all know about the kind of broader concern about polarization, but there's actually a lot of emerging evidence that our political identities are changing in some really important ways when we think about processing information, real or fake information. Political identities are growing more sorted, and by sorted I mean they are growing more consistent in terms of the overlap between their partisanship and ideology, and the strength of those partisan and political identities are growing. This means as this process is occurring, it has a few really important implications. People become more team-minded and become more in-group oriented, favoring in-groups more when their identities are aligned, and they become more team-minded and more hostile toward the out-group. Through many different studies now, we have pretty good evidence that political affect is strengthening, and that's occurring in part because of this process of our identities aligning with each other. Not only is our ideology now becoming more aligned with our partisanship, as we see kind of the trend of that change here, but our political identities are also becoming more aligned with our other social identities, whether they be racial, whether they be religious, whether they be about some other kind of social classification that we view as important. These are growing increasingly aligned with our political identities, which further exacerbates kind of the strength of those identities, but also the in-group and team-mindedness we have, and the tendency we have to view the other side as a hostile enemy. Importantly, for the receipt and acceptance of information, those tendencies were already in place in the sense that exposure to information from the other side, we were already likely to dismiss that information, to ignore it, to discount it, to counter-argue it. For the same reasons that we try to avoid that kind of information, when we do see that information, we use motivated reasoning and all other sorts of tools to sort of discount that information that goes against our beliefs. But in today's environment, where partisan identity is much more about the hostility we feel towards the other side, it also tends to be the case that when we encounter political information from the outgroup, or at least political information that opposes our own views, we view that as an outgroup message, and we treat that outgroup message with increasing hostility, and we dig in our heels even more on taking the opposite position. People used to have this idea that selective exposure was bad because it was always good to hear from the other side. But there's actually a lot of evidence that hearing from the other side only makes us more strongly attached to our original position and more likely to refute any counter-attitudinal information. Okay, so those changes actually tell us a lot about the information environment and how we react to it in general. But these stronger, more consistent partisan identities mean that we also react more emotionally to information we encounter in the political environment. Now, what does this mean? In general, probably bad things in terms of political life, some of which we're experiencing now. But it also means that we tend to be more concerned with whether the team wins than evaluating the team on the basis of matching our original preferences. This creates a lot of terrible incentives for the information environment in the sense that if we're judging our political leaders based mainly on whether they beat the other side and less about their policy performance, then that only increases their tendency to want to denigrate the other side and to use misinformation to do it. And it makes us less likely to hold them accountable for using misinformation and false claims to do those things. So this is, I think, something that we're seeing clear evidence of that is maybe being a little bit underappreciated when we think about the effects of misinformation. I think we're going to have a continually more permissive environment for the strategic use of misinformation as these political identities keep growing more hostile and stronger over time. As Catherine Hayhoe's talk and Rick's talk earlier in the series suggested, these tribal considerations seem to really dominate the preference process, We tend to even go so far as, let me move on here, to, according to some models, our partisan identity even exists first and dictates the way we judge information we encounter in the information environment. And we twist that information to match our partisan identity instead of, and then allow that to evaluate the party in ways that already match our political conceptions. We don't objectively observe the facts and see if the parties are matching our attitudes as the original, more rational-based voter models would suggest. So I think these have really important implications for the exposure part of the process. And again, there's a healthy literature developing talking about these changes to political identity, but it hasn't yet fully been integrated with a lot of the speculation about the misinformation environment. And the intergroup dynamics at play are really important for how we treat misinformation and information alike, especially depending on what side it comes from. But the prediction, I think, here would be that we probably have a lot to worry about with misinformation and these partisan identities, but at least in the immediate short term, these partisan identities mean that misinformation is almost certainly likely to be rejected because it comes from an outside or is perceived to come from an outside group, or if it is not rejected, again, it's probably not creating much political movement because it's just convincing people in a direction that they're already convinced. Encinal exposure is where we want to think about seeing real differences from the changes in the media environment. And this is partly for the reasons that I outline about political identity. So the motivated information-seeking people are going to be not experiencing many effects. But when we are in the setting of social media, for example, and we do see these higher rates of encinal exposure, this is where I think we need more research and where the implications might be higher. The guards here that we have against persuasion or people really being duped by misinformation are really about the nature of the content and the way content is shared on these different platforms. As I said, the attention is much more superficial. So even though the spread of information and even the sharing seems great, it's not clear yet how meaningful that content exposure is. And so we need a lot more work that especially focuses on the political nature of the content itself, the emotions and attention and how arousing the content it is, and how those things interact with the cognitive biases and the partisan identities that we already have in place. That's where we'll really find out kind of the conditions under which people will be most susceptible to this kind of exposure to misinformation on social media. So let's just turn, I guess, to thinking, I think I already mentioned a lot of the newer evidence on misinformation. I can kind of dovetail these to talk about how the changing political identity might impact some of the potential solutions that we think about with social media. So strengthening identities might insulate us from being persuaded in the short term, as I mentioned, but they can also blind us to important efforts to correct misinformation. This is a problem that we've already seen. There's a lot of research on how fact-checking and correctives to misinformation often don't work. These strong partisan identities and these existing predispositions are one reason for that. And our cognitive biases towards information that we're already familiar with or that we've already kind of grown attached to mentally. So the changing nature of political identity undermines factual information, possibly in this way too, by making us really inclined to reject corrections to misinformation if they come from the other side. For so many already, the partisan identity is the dominant social identity, so facts are going to continue to be less relevant for political making, for political decision making, than the tribe to which they belong. I think it's also important to think about that when corrections will work, and we've seen some examples of this, it's going to be when they're presented in a way that's not threatening to partisan identity. One evidence of this, there was a recent study that offered they called it inoculation to misinformation, and the way it worked, and it actually worked, was to warn people pre-exposure about some of the tendencies that information presented through the media, for example, has, and how it can mislead readers, like fake experts or the kind of false equivalency to true and false information. And when presented in that kind of upfront way, just reminding people of those hazards, it helps people resist or not be tricked by misinformation. Other kind of optimistic options or some optimistic findings in the research are that, and this will depend somewhat on the development or the continuing development of our political identities, but there's some evidence that elites are responsive to warnings about being held to account for the use of misinformation. So when you remind legislators that you are, or when the public or interest groups remind legislators that they are watching and that they might be punished electorally for using misinformation, there actually is, if they have the perception they're being monitored in that way, they do tend to curb that behavior. We obviously need more experimenting with how we can prevent and also correct misinformation when it is delivered or disseminated, especially on a mass scale. And then I think there's reason to expect that we will see the development of a lot of useful platform-based tools and user-based models aimed at detecting and removing misinformation from social media and other environments. Those are going to have to unfold with technology, and the problem is they can always be sort of counter-thwarted by people who are also refining their misinformation tactics. But I think another important thing to consider is just to keep our eye on the role that elites are playing in this. They are aware of the changing tides in political sentiment and political identity. They take advantage of it sometimes. They cue or orchestrate or at least sanction the use of misinformation. We need to think about what that means for our political health more generally and how that interacts with our changing political identities. And we also need to think about how that context, what that means for the way we process information across these different platforms with our cognitive biases in mind, but also with respect to the particular features of the content. And for all this, it's a lot to try to understand, and even though people are frantically doing research on it, there's basically a lot more to learn. I better end there. So, thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions, so if anyone has a question, I'll pass the mic. But before we get started, I'll ask Johanna, I hope the message here isn't that we invite more bread and circuses as entertainment to quell the masses, and that's the hope for our democracy.
Yeah, I don't think it is. I guess talking about the appeal of content and the arousing nature of content is more, I guess the way I'm thinking about it is more that it might be something to be worried about, that it can be strategically used to make the misinformation messages more appealing and more persuasive. There's evidence, about particular aspects of content that do make people lose focus, like virtual reality technologies, really immersive narrative, audiovisual tactics, negativity. All of these things can let people lower their guard against misinformation or counter-attitudinal information. But I'm more worried that that'll be a tool of the misinformers than as a savior.
Thank you. Hi, I was just wondering, so you said because of our partisan identity, we're unlikely to change our vote in response to misinformation, but what about all the young people that are in the process of becoming, finding what their partisan identity is, and they're exposed to all the fake news, and then how is that, influencing their partisan identity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the things that isn't clear is, and it's so hard to this is such a big conversation with a lot of layers. One of the problems is trying to distinguish between short-term immediate effects that we might see or not see and these longer-term trends. I think there's going to be a lot, I think there are a lot of ways that over time the exposure to misinformation might impact the continued development of our political identities. Even if in the short term there's no persuasion, I have to think there are effects over time. And I think those include going the other direction, right? Where new entrants to the political information environment will be affected differently, right? And again, those initial impressions that might start the process of their identity development or entrenchment, whatever you want to call it, could be based on false information, right? And those are also the people in the political environment we might expect to be the most vulnerable, and because of their experience, and also the most likely to spend a lot of time on social media platforms. So I think they are a population to look at for sure.
Yeah, I'm curious with regard to these generational differences. Maybe is there's I think a difference in the level of trust in media sources that younger people have, particularly with regard to the internet and different social media sources and things like that, versus older people. And has anyone looked at that, whether younger people are more susceptible to believing the fake news or older people are more susceptible to believing that?
I think there is evidence that there've been studies of students and their inabilities to detect fact from fiction and to prioritize misinformation over real information. With older people, I feel like I've seen something, but I can't remember. But I do think that there's probably different reasons pushing those two populations in the direction that they are in, right? So with older people, it'll be lack of experience with the online. With younger people, it's going to be lack of experience about all kinds of things, including political institutions and the incentives they create, and media institutions and the incentive they create, right? And the market considerations, right? The attention economy and all of that. So I think regardless, more work needs to be done on it, and especially the longer overtime process. Part of the problem is these technologies, some of these changes are so new, it's really hard to have any time periods that we can really get an idea of age-based turnover, cohort effects, things like that. But I think those studies are going to be critically important.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you very much. It's interesting, important. It sort of ties in with our whole discussion during this year about facts. And I guess I get a sense from what you're saying is that facts are so open to interpretation and that our biases and our tribal identities. But are there some examples of things that give us some reason to hope that as facts become more and more clear and unmistakable, attitudes can change and that new possibilities can emerge?
Yeah, in fact, there are more reasons for hope than I had time to get to. So even though these partisan identities are clearly really, really important and maybe the big driver, there is individual level variation in how we process information, right? So we have cognitive biases and tendencies for processing information. There's evidence, for example, that people with high need for cognition, even if they're partisan, they still process information in ways that are more in accordance with that original rational voter model, where that you actually are judging the party based on their performance and whether it's in line with your attitudes, rather than letting your partisan identity tell you what you think the facts mean. And then, so there is variation among us, even among partisans, and also those people that are those motivated information seekers. They might have stronger political attitudes, but a lot of those people are going to be they're seeking out that supplemental information for a reason, right? I can only imagine it's because they want to inform themselves with actual information. So I don't mean to accidentally lump all information seekers, motivated information seekers, in with all super strong, team-minded partisans. I do think that there are people that are seeking out information to become more informed and who are still applying those judgments in the way that kind of original voter models would have argued that they do. So there is hope. But I do think I do think finding clearer ways to send signals about the kinds of, I mean, another example is the more people become media sophisticated, where they know that what the incentives of media are, and all of those institutions that media interact with, the more they are able to be skeptical about the way information is presented, and the way information can be misleading. So I think, I mean, I hate to, it can't just be news literacy type interventions, but I think those will be an important supplement. And I think we'll continue to learn new tricks for improving our delivery of facts, and over time, as we scramble to sort of remedy some of this, right? The one reason I emphasize the problem with political identity, I see that as a more difficult problem to solve, because I think the societal processes that are pushing us in that direction are bigger, long-term societal problems that might be more difficult to deal with.
Well, thank you, Johanna. I'm going to invite everybody to a reception afterwards. If you have additional questions for Johanna, you can ask them. As for me, I'm going to go home and watch Game of Thrones and forget all this stuff and ignore the truth. Thank you very much, Johanna. I really appreciate it.